white paper that Andy Lacker has been leading the effort on. Turn it over to you.
Let me make it clear. I'm Andy Latcher. I lead one of the working groups. The other Andy, who didn't show up, leads a different working group. And so when people refer to Andy didn't do this, Andy didn't do that, it wasn't me, it's all the other Andy. I just want to make that clear. So I'm going to talk about the working group that I led, really more of a facilitator of the group. We were focused on airspace integration. And you saw from Husney's presentation about some of the challenges of a single pilot dealing with multiple aircraft that are in different sectors and what that means for when the pilot might need to pay attention. It didn't talk about, the communications frequency and what that means. It didn't talk about the controller workload, if the controller had to rebroadcast. Didn't talk about step-ons. It didn't talk about some of the challenges. It also didn't talk about situational awareness. And so we are operating under the premise that that's not feasible, that we had to find a way for end-to-end operations to occur without requiring routine air traffic control services.
So you're in the domain of mixed fleet aircraft, not probably using UTMs and drones.
I will talk about that.
Okay.
So we're looking, our assumption is talking about airspace integration is important because it's a significant barrier to realizing end-to-end operations. Because today, if an unmanned aircraft is to operate in airspace other than small UAS flying below 400 feet, other unmanned aircraft, if they are to operate in the airspace, they are flying under an IFR flight plan, which requires them to be talking to an air traffic controllers, and that voice-intensive air traffic control system, as well as the fact that air traffic control, for the most part, is human-centric, is probably not going to scale into an end-to-end operations. And so we were exploring mechanisms that go beyond the BVLOS rule that Tim talked about. And Tim didn't talk about the rule, and I want to go on record that Tim did not talk about the rule at this meeting, in case there's anyone listening. But I can talk about the rule a little bit based on what I've heard the FAA say in public forums. Nothing I'm going to say about the rule is something that's been said in private. This is all things the FAA has said in public, mainly to ASTM, which Mark leads, the F-38 group. The FAA intends to lean on industry-based community standards to realize many of the principles in that rule. And they have to give us some hints so we can start developing the standards, so the standards are ready when the rule becomes final. So the FAA, or the Department of Transportation, has publicized that this rule will be available by January 2025. The final rule is probably going to happen within approximately 2 years of that publication of the NPRM. There needs to be a comment period, and usually there's 18 months after the comment period. That's usually when we would see a final rule, but there's no guarantee that we would see a final rule then. But we're looking to the future. This is what happens after that rule enables operations. And the FAA has telegraphed they're looking at low-risk airspace. It is airspace likely to be below 400 feet, and it's likely to include what is defined by the UAS facility maps in Class B, C, and D airspace. They've essentially identified blocks of airspace below certain altitudes where unmanned operations can happen with automated approvals and notification capabilities. So the Air Traffic Management Organization has determined blocks of airspace where you can basically treat it like it is Class G airspace, but it's still hasn't changed the designation of the airspace. It's still B, C, and D airspace. And the FAA has said that This will apply to aircraft as big as 1,320 pounds. It doesn't mean 1,320 pounds aircraft, they're going to be allowed to be flying everywhere. They're not likely to be able to fly in a downtown city, and they're probably not even going to be able to fly in a suburban area. They're probably large, really large unmanned aircraft like those are probably going to be held to extremely rural or agricultural lands. But the rule will allow that. What we were talking about is concepts that could be the next step. And again, our group is just talking about concepts. We're not making a recommendation. We're not, we don't even have consensus on the concepts. But we had a bunch of smart people, and I was in the room too, a bunch of smart people who were in a room talking about what could be concepts that could work. And we thought we'd share those ideas with others to get the conversation going in the community. So, what are we talking about? Well, we want to minimize the routine interactions with ATC. The first way is we're going to have a mechanism to authorize VFR equivalent operations. And I'll say more about each of these strategic approaches. But basically, we will have technology that will enable VFR-like operations where we have VFR operations today. Think Class E airspace. At the same time, we want to expand Class E-like airspace into airspace that currently is Class B, C, and D. Again, this is going to be ATC or ATM organization pre-defined, pre-approved airspace, similar to what they're doing today with the facility map altitudes, where they set a ceiling and the floor is the surface. Here, there'll be blocks of airspace that will be predetermined to behave like Class E airspace for the purpose of VFR equivalent operations. And then we're not talking about aircraft that have to be end-to-end from takeoff to landing. Maybe end-to-end during part of the operation, but during other parts of the operation, it could be remotely piloted one-to-one as needed. So, we are talking, and Barry and I were talking about this before, we are talking about unmanned aircraft, but we're not talking about small unmanned aircraft. We're talking about unmanned aircraft because there's no point in doing end-to-end operations for anything other than unmanned aircraft. So everything we're talking about is unmanned aircraft. So we will use terminology like unmanned aircraft almost interchangeably with the aircraft that is operating end-to-end. And this contrasts to how we do, and I want to emphasize unmanned aircraft, not just small ones, but larger unmanned aircraft like Tim's, this Tim, not the FAA Tim, the General Atomics Tim. The Tim flies his aircraft routinely in the NAS, or his aircraft are flown by his customers routinely in the NAS today, but they're flown one-to-one under IFR flight plans. There is a couple of exceptions, and they're pretty exciting, but there's a couple of exceptions where they can operate VFR like today under FAA certificates of authorization or waiver. So that's what's happening. First of all, any questions about that?
This is one of the concepts that you're going to talk about.
Well, we have an alternative, and I'll talk about the alternative. Again, we're just putting ideas on the table. We're not making a recommendation. In fact, we want to make that clear. So we have clarity because we have people at the table in our group who have expertise representing important stakeholder constituencies. They don't want to go on the record as saying, hey, we're making a recommendation to the FAA. We're not an aviation rulemaking committee. We are not tasked by the FAA to make a recommendation on what the future should hold. So we are trying to walk a fine line with sharing ideas that a bunch of smart people discuss and making a recommendation. We're also not representing consensus. So there are ideas we just talked about where we don't have 100% agreement, but people agree that, yeah, that's a legitimate idea that should be discussed. And we demonstrate that by not only talking about one single-threaded idea, we present an alternative as well. The other thing is, and this is something that isn't universal in our documentation yet, but I want to talk with our team. I think we need to write in a style that talks about what the working group talked about, as opposed to describing a future system. We shouldn't be describing this is what the future might look like. We should describe what the group talked about. So a lot of that is how you phrase things. So the group talked about X, Y, and Z versus X, Y, and Z is how it would work. And it's a subtlety, but it makes it clear to the reader that we're just sharing ideas. And so we put this together, and I think, to be quite frank, it could belong in all of the white papers, because I think that would keep us above board. We don't have some of the more sensitive stakeholder groups here today, but they have been involved in some of our other meetings, and we want them at the table having these discussions. We don't want to alienate them by, if they're at the table having these discussions, that they are now signing up and implying consensus in what we're saying. Is that helpful? Anyone have a problem with that? Okay. So the way we worked, we had a very detailed annotated outline. We spent all of our time on the annotated outline. We met, I think it was bi-weekly for several months, working on this annotated outline as a group. We had a cross-section of people representing the air traffic management community, representing traditional aviation, as well as the new entrants. And then there were a couple of researchers and academics at the table as well. And we're now in the process of turning our annotated outline, where we focused on the content, we're now in the process of turning that into a white paper where we're working on the actual language that explains. And you can see how hard it is to do that, because anyone in the front row can see that the annotated outline might not match necessarily word for word the prose that were then written. And those in the back just look and turn it back on them. So where are we? We have 9 sections, and we're making good progress. We have a first draft completed for every single section except one. The summary section, we figured we probably should write the summary section until we're done, and then we can then write the summary. That didn't make sense, so that is green. And this is really hard for a colorblind guy to do, a stoplight chart, by the way. It's a good thing PowerPoint tells you what the colors are. So we have first drafts of 7 of the 8 sections, which is good. I bet I'm the only one who's read or scanned, or skimmed, I should say, all 7 of those sections. We as a group have not put it together. So we have 7 parts. We don't have a whole as of yet. In fact, the last part was uploaded this morning. So the one that says complete, I'm told it's now uploaded. So we are making progress, but our work now is making this a cohesive whole, as opposed to of 7 parts. We had many different contributors. Tim was one of the contributors. Nick Zyla from WISC was a major contributor. He overcommitted, in my mind. He committed to a lot of different sections, and he wrote a fair bit. He's not here today, but he was very active in our discussions and in our working groups. Tim, I don't know if you want to add anything about our process.
No, that's a pretty good summary. Yeah, I mean, yeah, just lots of good ideas, and testing those ideas, with other people in the group, having legacy pilots and air traffic controllers is always an excellent way to test new ideas.
And they didn't, operate under the assumption that everything that's put on the table is a bad idea. They were helping to try to shape the idea to be better, and we benefited from their presence immensely. So the rest of this, I'm just going to go through at a real high level what's in each section, and then we can talk a little bit about some areas which I think cut across all of the working group activities. So, I think I've already covered the purpose and the motivation. We made a couple of assumptions. We don't specifically spend a lot of time talking about the specific technologies. we're making assumptions that the technologies will come along. There's a community that's developing a lot of these technologies. What we focused is, how would these technologies be applied to an operational change? And so technologies like UTM, yes. DAA, yes. These are technologies that we assume, but we're not necessarily going into detail about how they would be employed to realize this future. We did say, however, that this is not just about Part 91, and it's primarily about Part 91 and Part 135 operations. And the other thing is, a lot of the technologies we're talking about are going to get their first exposure to regulator approval through the BVLOS operations that are going to be enabled by the BVLOS NPRM. A lot of the technologies we're talking about are the things that are going to need to be in place in order for us to do BVLOS even below 400 feet for smaller UAS. It's now the technology is going to have to work at a greater scale, if you will. So one thing I think we need to talk about is clarity of terms. One term that's bounced around a lot is end-to-end in this group. And then there was this whole discussion about the ratio, even if it was a good idea to talk about end-to-end, because everyone wants to talk about what is the right ratio. And there was even discussion, is it 5 to 50 or is it really 1 to 10? And what we think we're talking about is multi-aircraft operations. And maybe it would behoove us to not talk about end-to-end. So right now, the paper is written using the shorthand end-to-end. Maybe we should be using the term multi-aircraft operations and not use the shorthand end-to-end, because that puts the audience in a space that focuses on the ratio. And what's the correct ratio? What's the ultimately right ratio? And maybe it's more about what's the scope of the exceptions and the breadth of the complexity of the decisions that need to be made, independent of what that ratio is. And so we have a definition for multi-aircraft operations. I know section 1 and 2 were originally written with the term multi-aircraft operations throughout, and it was changed to end-to-end. Other sections have a mix of end-to-end and multi-aircraft operations. We're going to harmonize within our paper, but maybe we want to think about this, and I turn this to the group. Maybe we don't want to use the term end-to-end in our products. Maybe we just want to, I know it's a mouthful, multi-aircraft operations doesn't roll off the tongue the way end-to-end does. And certainly the tattoo doesn't look as good, because I have both, by the way. Not telling you where. But the end-to-end operations may be the more correct term, and maybe what we should be using. What do people think?
Yeah, I think we kind of started to go down that road after Mark's talk, I think, and thinking about that it's really exceptions, and we were talking about EDA and stuff like that. But I think it's a more inclusive term that probably makes sense in my mind, to utilize instead of necessarily end-to-end, because I think that does imply a certain ConOps.
What are your thoughts, Mark, since you were one of the proponents of reduced focus on the ratio?
So this multi-aircraft operations versus end-to-end.
Right, using the terms, just the terms we use. Words matter. And having led terminology groups in ASTM, and I know you've been involved in many of the fights over terminology in ASTM, words matter and terminology matters. So,
I've heard this one first time.
Yes, ma'am. I forgot your name, I'm sorry.
I'm Kara.
Kara.
Yeah, being new to the group, this seems to represent what I've been hearing the last week, because I've gotten to know what you all are doing. So just a new person's perspective.
Gary.
As another thought, multi-aircraft operations is sort of descriptive of what it is, whereas end-to-end, we're not already familiar with what that's referring to, and it's just probably kind of a confusing term.
Yeah.
Is multi-aircraft operations sufficiently specific? If it's someone coming from outside of this realm, I think everyone does multi-aircraft operations every day right now.
Yeah, they call it
Given this
dispatch.
definition, right?
Or you need aerial refueling, you need,
Is there some way of being
Well,
slightly more specific where you're not specifically the N aspect, but
We do define it, and that's the
Right.
definition that occurs in our document. So you don't think that definition helps explain it?
no, I don't really.
Okay, that's
I
good.
mean, I do think that that's the only drawback that I see is that we've kind of promoted this group and promoted this area as MDN. And now if we change it, people are gonna say, well,
Is it the same thing?
is it the same thing?
Well, that's why we changed it back in the draft.
So,
I think aircraft operations is already from the street when they are to the multi-aircraft management side of the aircraft operation and we're talking about Q. So I think you can define it, but I think it's already defined. And there's a danger. There was a term multi-aircraft control that I think was circulated with this group of used at some point, which to me is more descriptive than the word operations. Operations is very generic. This is more of a supervisory control.
The only thing with the word control is, in some people's minds, they go right to air traffic control. So maybe we should say multi-aircraft management or something like that, or supervision, to get at those ideas. Garrett, you,
There's a comment from Wendy online saying that they want to align with JARIS multiple simultaneous UA flight operations.
and now that's a mouthful.
yeah.
That wouldn't fit where I have my tattoos.
I think it's clear that this is better. But is it worth the change at this point?
Well, and that's why I'm bringing it to the group here.
I'm not totally sure.
At the FAA side, we usually think of one pilot, one aircraft. It's a mentality change just in our own, I'm thinking of FAA as a whole, is one pilot, multiple aircraft. And you have multiple pilots controlling multiples of aircraft, which is our MN, okay? But then we started sitting down thinking, you could have the reverse. I know you said two or more aircraft, well, maybe it's one aircraft with multiple pilots. And the reason is maybe you depart from, say, Seattle and you're flying to New York and it's gonna go through different pilots, just like sectors
Right.
across the country. Maybe one pilot's responsible for the West Coast, or maybe responsible for a certain airport to get aircraft out of there and hand it over to the next one. The next one manages. So we've been trying to think of how different directions this could really end up going in. It doesn't necessarily, you know, I'm just thinking outside the box here. I think the MDN still fits all.
All right, well, I got clear direction. Maybe.
I mean, it's still like, the thing's probably in, maybe still, you're still flagging in number of aircraft, not still arguing against the number of aircraft.
Right.
So.
I just wanted to push back on this sticking power of the old name, because for the purpose of this working group is to evolve and to set the scene for the future. This is still very early stages, so we shouldn't be stuck on it just for the sake of being stuck on it.
But there's some political realities, though, that I think that exist. And when you have called something M-to-N for 3-4 years, and then you change the name, and you keep this working group together, you know, it's NASA management gonna look at that and go, they're doing the same stuff, they just changed the name, they're trying to like pull one over on us, you know?
Or we've evolved, to your point, we've evolved and we've learned. We actually got smarter after doing research in the community for 3 years.
The goal to work out that actually end-to-end isn't obvious to people. Maybe multi-aircraft operations isn't either, maybe it's multi-aircraft management instead. But that could be a decision that the working group makes to go and kind of have an established terminology for it that makes more sense.
I also think, I'm not sure we hang up on picking a term. And, you know, when I write, I use multi-aircraft operation, multi-aircraft control, end-to-end as they are needed in the document, and I don't follow them killing the document. When I write the title, I find multi-aircraft control, multi-aircraft operation simultaneously. Depending on what that focus is more appropriate for the title, because I can convey linguistically and should show. But then at the paper comes with the ratio and find the thing using in that way. Like,
What did we use in the RTCA thing?
Well,
I think
This
it's
is
good.
much broader than the RTCA paper, though.
That is true, yeah, that's true. I think it's a good discussion.
Yeah.
I think also.
Maybe we're not gonna solve it here.
I think officially the name of the working group is multi-vehicle control in parentheses end-to-end.
yes, actually, that's where this term came from. And I'm allergic to using the word vehicle when I'm talking about aircraft. So I have a problem doing that. So I want to use aircraft. That's just a personal problem. Because vehicles have four wheels and drive around on the ground. You know, aircraft fly and they're regulated by the FAA. Let's not talk about ultralight vehicles, but for the most part, the FAA does not use the term vehicle. So I think it's more appropriate for aircraft. And that's true ICAO and internationally as well. So, but do people like multi-vehicle control, multi-vehicle management, or multi-vehicle supervision better?
Yeah, correct.
yeah, I think those all.
Well, oh God, thank you. Yeah, I'm a good straight man.
Those are what which is kind of, yeah, control, I mean, control means for
You know, control.
stick,
Yeah.
yeah, versus management, involvement, supervision might be helpful.
I don't like control at all.
No.
I prefer management or supervision. I have trouble with the difference between the two. I've been a manager and I've been a supervisor. It seemed like it was the same job. And so
One pays better.
it depends on where you work.
I tend to think management's a little more broad than supervision.
Supervision implies more attention than management,
Does it?
in my mind.
Well, and management sounds more active than supervision too, right?
The other thing is accountability, which is another area I'm spending a lot of cycles of my research time on. And accountability management aligns more to the notion of accountability, because ultimately this multi-aircraft, whatever we call them, is accountable for the operation. And management versus supervision sounds like, clearer on accountability. The other thing is the term multi-vehicle supervisor is what WISC uses to describe their belly button, for that's doing this function. So. Okay, well, we can talk about it again. You got wrap up time. People can think about it and
think about it.
and
I think it's probably, I think you bring up a good point. It probably is time to be off the end to end, and see if we can get a term that people tend to agree with.
And I personally blame Mark, because he was the one who brought
Yeah, basically.
he brought the fallacy of N up originally, and I think he made a really good point.
Now we're gonna also redefine autonomy too, right?
Oh, sure.
I've had a lot of cycles on that.
Life, I think. That never.
The other thing is the term pilot. And what do we call, and I use the euphemism belly button, but what do we call that human being that is doing this function? Are they a pilot? Are they a supervisor? That's the term that WISC uses. Are they an operator? That confuses them with the BEGO operator that we were all talking about earlier this morning. Andy Latch's personal opinion, and our working group has come to this conclusion, that we should call him a pilot. And we should call him a pilot or a pilot in command because they're the ones accountable for flight. And we have a bunch of regulations already written about the human being that is responsible for the safety of flight, and we call them pilots. And whether they're in a management role, you know, the pilot in command is the pilot in command, even if they're not sitting in a pilot seat, they're still the pilot in command. They can't touch the controls, could be asleep in the back. They're still the pilot in command. And so we have a construct that exists for us. Mark and I wrote a white paper for ASTM on this topic where we talked about the command authority of the pilot in command. And it just seems like it may be worthwhile to keep with terms people know.
Yeah, I've
Let me
had
ask you,
this fight too, and I like remote pilot. or
We could,
remote pilot
I'm fine with a
to
modifier.
make the distinction, but
so when you think pilots get stick and rudder skills, you know, and the Army started doing from ground control stations.
Right.
They didn't have that kind of experience.
We make that
How do
very,
you call one a pilot and
we make that very clear here in our definition that they may not have the same skill sets. They may have a unique set of skill sets for the job they're being asked to do.
Right.
They may not have the ratings to fly a 172. They may not have the ratings to fly anything that would have a human being on, you know, them on board. They are trained to be, to operate the aircraft remotely. They don't have to have the skills, the inner loop skills, the stick and rudder skills that might be required of traditional pilots. And so we are, I don't want to say redefining the term, we are clarifying what we mean by the pilot in this case. It's not equivalent of the pilot, you know, Tim pointed out he was a pilot, you know, and I don't know how many other pilots are in the room. They're not the same thing as this future pilot, and they may not have the same skills that a pilot has today. So,
They have the same legal responsibility.
yes.
Safety plan.
yes, Mark.
A lot of thoughts on this. We still call our folks pilots, partly because Tim makes us. No, we still call our folks pilots. I don't think that's the future forever. I mean, I don't think they have the same responsibility forever either. And I think I've heard that one way may move towards like authority or responsibility moves to a big O operator.
Accountability being a big O operator.
Here's the question. I mean, I don't know. I tend to disagree that for to be a pilot. Like, I don't know. I think a new term is due. To be honest, but it depends on the level of automation.
And is the new term due now in the white papers this group is writing, or is the new term coming in the future? I don't know.
Well, I mean, we're living in the future in some ways, so I don't mean.
What do you suggest?
We lean most closely to supervisor, although there's things I don't like about that as well. But we lean most closely that way. I don't like operator because it uses everybody when we're talking about it.
Yeah.
Big O.
Yeah, I think that's a bad.
I mean, for this concept in particular, we're looking at near-term operations. We're looking at what can be done with rules that exist today without significant rule changes. We're talking about waivers and exemptions. And so, you know, there isn't a different terminology in the rules today. So this, certainly for this section, pilot is the appropriate term because that works with today's rule set. We don't want to be dependent on a change in rules
Or a significant change.
Well,
And that was the point, Tim's point was the one that prevailed in our working group's discussion, which led us to, we're gonna use that term.
well, that's not 100% correct.
Okay,
Take a look, you have pilot certificates, and if you're a pilot, there's sport, there's rec, there's private, there's commercial, and there's ATV, okay? Those are pilot certificates. The remote pilot has a remote pilot certificate, and by remote, that remote pilot is by definition in the regulations. So that would actually, instead of calling them pilot, they're a remote pilot. And we want to really emphasize that
The remote, yeah.
because they can't count any flight time. They can't count any of their experience that they do as a remote pilot or as being a pilot. Those are two things.
so people would be good with if we use this term remotely.
Yes.
Yes, if you're gonna say pilot, it's gotta be at least a remote pilot, talk about UN. Now, I wanna say, if you're using the word pilot, it's gotta be a remote pilot. Hint. Think outside the box here. And No, I can't talk about 108. But I can tell you that you're not gonna find that word in there anywhere. And so think outside the box. And y'all just said operator. I was a big proponent of calling these people operators long ago, because you're not a pilot. You have no skills. Now, there's a difference between a remote pilot under 107, which is what we get our certificate, or a regular pilot. Both of them have skills. A remote pilot still has to be able to manipulate controls. Yaw, pitch, roll, right? That's remote pilot. Okay, if you're not manipulating controls, you have no skills to go with it. I'm sorry, punching a keyboard or moving a mouse is not a skill. So we've been trying to get away from the word of calling them even a remote pilot for that reason. I'm trying to separate as far away as we can. So just my heads up.
Is it one here? Doesn't it like other controllers?
So come up with something you like. Supervisor or manager are two different things. And in the fact that we look at a supervisor manager as someone that's over top of someone else. And that is also being used right now. We have operators that have remote pilots under Part 135, and they have supervisors that are over so many remote pilots that watch. This way, if a remote pilot has a problem, they can jump in there and help out.
Remote operators.
Well, so
Operator
you
is
have an autopilot.
big O.
So you have a supervisor over a number of autopilots.
Like an active supervisor over a person.
Right.
Supervisor
I
over
would
a team.
Sure.
That's another interesting term there. Is I hear people misuse autopilot. It's not an autopilot. An autopilot can be disengaged and must be disengaged under Part 135 or Part 121. is certain opposite. So the pilot has to be on board for an autopilot. If there's no pilot on board, it's an auto flight system. And it's certified from takeoff to landing as an auto flight system.
Okay, well, these are two topics that, go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry.
How about we think of remote operator?
I personally, as much as I have an allergy to the word vehicles, I have a problem using the word operator other than the big O, because we have a formal definition of operator, and we are going to have operators in the future. And it just adds to confusion. Which operator are we talking about? And saying big O operator every time. I used to work in operational control and dispatch, and that was a whole different world. When we used the word operator, we meant something quite different.
I would say the word operator though is the most generic that we can define without the word supervisor or manager have a certain.
But it's already defined.
Yeah.
Well, but defining each general term always has some trouble. I don't have a problem taking the word operator to redefine it. But to take the word supervisor,
But Tim's point is a real strong point. We were right, our white paper was about what could happen next. We actually at one point were calling it initial, but we think BB loss is going to, rule is going to be the initial operation. It's really the next step after that. And now's not the time to introduce a whole bunch of new terms that don't have a regulatory construct, when there are terms that we could take advantage of that already have a regulatory construct, like operator has a regulatory construct about it.
Well, and, ICAO is using remote pilot,
Right.
right?
Remote pilot and command is the ICAO term.
Yeah.
Annex 6, Part 4.
And I'm not sure why we want to, consistency is not a bad thing.
And if you haven't read Annex 6, Part 4, I recommend reading it. It explicitly calls out that you can't have multi-vehicle operations. But just an observation. Okay, well, I think we've talked about this enough, but these are the kind of things that we think is important. And this is in our section 1. So section 2 really lays out our strategic approach, which I already did. But we also point out that it's not the only feasible approach. This is just one thing the group spent a lot of time talking about. There are other feasible approaches, and it actually draws a lot on what Tim was saying. That maybe what we want to do is align our future remote pilots. See, I used remote pilot. with the controllers. So you'd have a remote pilot responsible for a set of aircraft, but they're all in one sector. So that remote pilot is talking to one controller. And then when the controller hands off the aircraft, the remote pilot would hand off the aircraft to another remote pilot, kind of as Tim was describing. So we are going to include that to, one is an example of, this is not the only feasible approach. There are pros and cons with this approach, but we're going to include it in our paper as well. Again, I think I've talked about all of these things, right? Oh yeah. What did you say, Tim?
Yeah, so since today's VFR operations are obviously dependent upon human vision in the cockpit, they're restricted to VMC, so visual meteorological conditions. And as we discussed, the technology-enabled VFR equivalent, particularly with detect-avoid technologies using radar, they're not dependent on human vision or even any optical technologies, and so could still perform the same functions in IMC. So we don't see IMC as a barrier to these VFR equivalent operations.
Well said, sir.
That has some interesting implications for air traffic control and others, which we discussed.
We discussed in the paper. The other thing, and I want to point out, one of the things we did was we didn't just leave it there. We don't solve all the problems. We just say, hey, these are some areas that we really require some additional study, and which can provide some hints for NASA on what else needs to be done, by the way. The idea of ATC, and again, we emphasize pre-approved airspace for these VFR equivalent operations. There are underutilized segments of the airspace today where the controllers, I don't want to say don't care, but they don't spend a lot of energy focused upon, because it's airspace that has very few operations. Can we make use of this airspace for these VFR equivalent operations, especially since some of them may or may not be going to traditional airports, and they may be able to take advantage of this airspace. So this idea is about enhancing efficiency. Again, the air traffic management organization is in control of this decision. They do the determinations just like they determine the altitudes of facility maps. And I can tell you, having been working very closely with the FAA when those facility maps were defined, some facilities came back and said all the grids in their airspace were zero. There was no altitude that was accepted. And it was an iterative process for them to define an acceptable ceiling for unmanned aircraft operations. And most of the facilities found a reasonable altitude that they can believe aircraft can operate safely under the automated process under LANS. And then one of the keys was we're not changing the designation of the airspace, which by the way is rulemaking if you change airspace designation. So it's not changing airspace designation, and ATC, for whatever reason, can take that airspace back and basically not authorize operations in that airspace if there's an operational reason that they are aware of that would preclude the continued operations, just like they do with LANS today. The other is, and I think we already spoke about this, the notion of transitioning between modes, where you go from M to N in some instances, which by the way fits a lot nicer on briefing slides than multi-aircraft operations. And the tattoo hurts a lot less too. The idea of transitioning back and forth between these operating modes, and maybe you'd go one-to-one, you'd even go IFR. For example, if you're landing at a airport that is a controlled airfield, you may have to go IFR and one-to-one to land there. You take off again. As you reach a certain point in your flight, you can then transition to end-to-end operations for the bulk of your flight, and maybe even transition back again if necessary. And this would help things like regional air mobility and some of these other concepts that are being pursued in the community. And then I already spoke about the alternate approach. We're going to put that in there as well. And we didn't end it without saying, hey, this is not easy. We identify a bunch of challenges, which we explain, and we talk a little bit about the operating environment, what has to happen in the operating environment, including the needs for communication with the air traffic control system. And this gets a little bit into the technologies of what will take to make this happen. You're going to need, and this was a term that wasn't necessarily discussed as a group, but was introduced into the draft, the notion of a conflict management framework. This roughly aligns to the ICAO 3 layers of conflict management. You would need a strategic deconfliction capability, AKA UTM. You would need a tactical deconfliction capability. We see much of this as being self-separation, like VFR operates today, is the self-separation mode. And you need a detect and avoid capability that roughly aligns to the collision avoidance on the ICAO GATMOC layers of conflict management. Traffic situational awareness is key to this, and this includes the surveillance, not only onboard the aircraft, but maybe off-board surveillance. And you would need a Lance-like, again, Lance-like, not expanding Lance, capability to do these operations in the designated airspace that is Class B, C, or D today. And with that, I'm going to close with a commercial. No, don't clap yet. This is a commercial. I have time for a commercial.
It was a slow clap.
Okay. If you're interested in this topic, ASTM, and ASTM has been mentioned a lot in this workshop already. ASTM has a workshop, or symposium we call it, next month in Santa Clara, where we will be talking specifically about the ASTM Working Group 76044 product that is in process. The chair of the group is going to be leading a panel where that product will be discussed. I'll be chairing a panel on what happens when automation misbehaves. This workshop has been growing over the last 5 years. The agenda includes keynotes from some industry leaders, as well as panel discussions. It's a small workshop, slightly larger than this group, probably about twice the size of this group. So it allows a lot of time for networking with real leaders in the community. It's heavily attended by industry and somewhat industry-led. And then to make things even more convenient, one of the ASTM working groups that is working on the airworthiness standards is having a meeting immediately following, so you can then attend that meeting where much of the focus of the meeting will be on automation related to the BV loss rulemaking effort and the work we're doing to develop standards in that community. And that is going to be hosted by Mark at Wing. And if you haven't gone to a meeting at Google, they feed you way too well. And with that, any questions? Sir.
I know this is just one concept that you decided to kind of flesh out, but when people talk about the ATC interaction, a common solution, candidate solution that people talk about is data link, or some sort of digital communication instead of voice. Did you guys discuss that? And
we did, and some of us have been working on datacom in the ATC environment. My wife started at the MITA Corporation in 1984. Her first project was datacom for ATC.
So we should have it down by now.
Just to give you an idea of how long this has been in the process for air traffic management. Right now, it is really just used to send messages. It's really not truly data communication. We're not exchanging data. We are exchanging messages over a data pipe. We are still a human-centric air traffic control. We are still bound by human capabilities, and I don't think, personal opinion, it is going to greatly enhance the ability to do multi-aircraft operations. You know, I joke all the time. I was a parent of 4 children. I'm used to having 4 conversations at the same time, but most human beings are not. And especially when you have to have a situational awareness about what's going on to be able to accept or decline an air traffic control instruction based on the safety of flight. And to have that awareness it's just really hard to do over, you know, when you have a human-centric process.
Yeah.
No matter what the method of communication is. And there's talk about how we can use voice recognition, or we can use automation to send voice messages, and it will avoid step-ons by waiting for a clear channel and do all these things. We're trying to automate a manual process by automating the fringes of manual process when it's. This is my opinion. I don't know, Tim, you were in on all those discussions. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's what you were specifically saying there about the actual
Is
voice
it-
communication part being only the periphery of the decision making.
Yeah.
I think we just, there was general consensus that that the technology doesn't exist to adequately replace human functions in that method, that methodology. Both for the natural language processing and then the understanding of what to do with those instructions, and as you say, to make a safety assessment. Because you know,
Yeah, I think
we don't just want-
negotiations are.
we don't just want a system that automatically implements everything that says, because air traffic control is assuming they're talking to a pilot with situational awareness, who will then be responsible for carrying out that action or not.
Yeah, and then you're gonna propagate any errors and that kind of stuff.
And the air traffic controllers don't have the tools they need. You know, doing vectors over datacom is just not not viable. And so you don't want to have some flights that you can't use certain capabilities with, which the air traffic controller, it would add workload to the air traffic controller to have a portion of their flights where, well, don't vector those aircraft because the datacom can't keep up with it.
I'm not sure I agree with you guys. I think as you increase the number of operations, I think Jay's right. Data link is gonna be the primary mode of communication, and it need be an emergency situation, we go to voice communication. That's.
But I've sat plugged in with air traffic controllers in the terminal area. I just can't see them doing, putting aircraft on long finals and
Traffic
stuff.
controls may not be doing this. There may be third-party operators that are doing this, or kind of figuring out what automation capabilities or software is needed to do this.
Well,
You're
that's
When it's a
assuming.
human, when it's a human that's doing the decision making,
Right.
voice is a natural, instinctive, and rapid way of communicating that decision. If you're having to convert that voice into data, or having to convert that human decision making into data, that's actually not as efficient as voice. Whereas if you have an automated system that's producing the instructions, wholly different story. It's natively data, and communicating with data is very efficient. But whereas the human that's the decision maker, it turns out voice is the most efficient way.
But if you could have a system, and I think the technology is getting there, that could do voice detect with a high degree of accuracy, then you're eliminating the inherent serial nature of voice. Plus, you're providing an external memory aid to everybody of exactly what it is. I mean, right now, pilot gets a clearance auditorially, hears it, thinks he's got it, and goes on. This way, he's got it there. So, I mean, I think there's work to be done, but I'm not sure I would be ready to say it's not viable.
Well, we just don't see it as a silver bullet solution. Even if because you're still, unless we go to a world the way Barry's describing it, where you have automated air traffic management, that's a different world. But if it's human-centric air traffic management, it's going to be a while before we. And again, back to first principles. What happens next after BV loss rule? Not what the end state is. This is not about the end state. This is about where are we going
Exploiting
next?
exploiting existing systems.
Right.
Well, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say, I think, saying something, I think some people see data link as a next step, and it doesn't need to implement as much as you guys are talking about here. And it could enable some operations. It could be the next.
But keep in mind, what do we do with data link today? We do frequency changes, we do departure clearances, and a couple of other things. We are not doing all of the job of traffic management over data.
Data link is very powerful. We use it in the Gulf Streets all the time. It's great for crews, like once you're up and going, they want to give you a reroute or whatever, you can load it. But remember, anything going into data link, as you said with ATC, how long does it take the ATC person to put it into the data link to be sent to the pilot? Then the pilot holds it up, reviews it, and agrees to it, and then subs it, and then enters it, so it enters into their system. It's great because one button I can push, but I can't tell you, even as a Gulfstream pilot, I can't tell you how many times I look down going, that don't look right, or I ain't gonna do that, and have to go back and forth with them. Data link's great, especially when you're in communications areas where you don't have good communication going across the water and all, across the holes and all. But once you get down into you're down below 10,000 feet, you're talking to the approach controllers and all. When you fly, I don't know how many of y'all are pilots, but if you fly, say, it's very different flying from, say, Texas here, and I gotta slow it down so the controller knows who I'm talking to. First time up in New York, I'd be ready to answer the call, because they're gonna be calling out to you so fast you gotta listen. They gotta hear your call sign out the other person's call sign. And it's a very different world between where the type of operations are taking place.
Absolutely. I did work, I was the data link program manager at 2 different airlines. And I have one chief pilot that won't let the dispatcher over ACARS send a message with the flight plan and let it auto load into our FMS. He required the pilots to retype it because he wanted the pilot situational awareness by them doing the typing. That was his notion. There is some data behind that, but there's also room for a lot of mistakes. and so he didn't even want the capability built into our airplanes. So we had an air gap between ACARS and our FMS. Not an air gap, it was a logic gap, but yeah.
I think data link is a direction that's coming. But the fact is, they can't just use it for one type of operation and not all the operations. Since the majority of the aircraft out there are crewed aircraft, and the crewed aircraft needs to know what the uncrewed aircraft. We've had a discussion about like going into control for example. The crewed aircraft, the aircraft each know what the unmanned aircraft is, and only they know if like.
Well, with that, I thank you, and I hope to see you all in Santa Clara.
Now, we're gonna have Scott Sheff, you know, talk about small UAS, but before he does that, I want to mention something about the terminology discussion. I feel like making decisions among, you know, in real time among the group is a little ad hoc, right? And I think that if I still ran this group, I won't be, I would put together a terminology group that lists out the specific candidates, the pros and cons, who's, you know, what's ICAO using, what's JARUS using, what's ASTM using, and you know, get it all sort of in one place that we could look at it and make a more, I think, more comprehensive, informed decision.
No, I think it's a good idea.
Let Tim run the group.
Just like a guy's retiring to throw a grenade.
But that's essentially what we did under ASTM. And we, under ASTM, we had a group that specifically looked at some of these terms. And both Mark and I were involved in some of those efforts. So, yeah, I'm happy to be part of that group. So. Well, we're still working on it. Because no one will listen.
No, I just think it'd be better to do a bit more.
No, I totally agree. I'm
glad you brought it up.
I was not expecting closure. I was expecting that we needed to put this on the table as these are the issues that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Okay, that's all. Scott.
All right, thanks. Well, I'm glad we decided on terms, because that means I don't have to change my slideshow.
The down button. That's the up button. Okay.
Maybe.
Maybe not.
Oh, for some reason, there's a wait for that one.
Oh, there we go.
I
Okay,
anticipated and,
boom.
yeah. I
But
don't-
only when it switches to different presenter.
Yes.
Good job.
No, we're doing it.
All right. So thanks, guys. Appreciate the time to talk with everyone. So Garrett Sadler, myself, a couple others represent the Small UAS Working Group. And some of you might remember us from way back in 2021. It's the same group you guys have known and loved. This year, we have a slightly different mission statement, which was to identify what can we do to help move the stake, if you will, write a white paper, which would be part of the white paper that we talked about, or maybe not. In this case, it probably won't be. We're about 99% done. Depending on how many questions there are after this presentation, will determine how close to 100% we are. So keep that in mind, especially if you want this thing to get out the door. But what we want to do today is talk about the working group and what we've come up with for this past year. Again, founded in 2021, we have approximately 80 members. 79 was actually the last count I got. Of those 79, at any one time in our meetings, we have about 30 to 35 people online. We held virtually. You guys are welcome to join. Please see Garrett and myself after the meeting if you're interested in getting on our list. They're quarterly, they're virtual, they're a lot of fun. We tackle different issues in the small UAS realm, and we always have what we call a speaker series, where someone from our group will talk about something they're working on, something that's near and dear to them, as it's related to UAS, which is really interesting because sometimes I know for myself, I'm sure most of you guys here too, we're so heads down in the weeds of things, we sometimes forget to lift up our head, take a breath, and see what other people are working on also as it relates to our body of research. For this year, we decided what would be really important. We've looked in the past at ConOps, we've looked at public acceptance, we've looked at safety, and we thought, you know what? With all the changes, not just in terminology like we have today, but in technologies also, what we don't hear a lot of talk about is training. We also don't hear a lot of talk about what types of people we're going to need to operate or supervise or pilot these assets, what types of roles we're going to need as well, and how we select them. We thought, you know, this might be a prime time to take a look at this and put this into a paper. So, as luck would have it, a lot of members of our group happen to be with the FAA, happen to be with NASA, happen to be in academia or industry that are researching these issues right now. We have folks from the Department of Defense on our group as well, and they were able to tell us about their training for UAS. We were able to talk with folks from the Denver Police Department, from the Los Angeles Fire Department, from the state of Virginia, from groups like drone responders on how they put together their training, how they do their personnel selection. I'd also like to say that when it came to writing this paper, while we're 79 strong, there were a few people that I want to specifically call out that were really critical in writing this paper, adding to it, reviewing it, which are these folks here, which we definitely could not have gotten this far if it was not for them. The report itself is broken out into 9 sections. I'm not going to deep dive on all of it today, although hopefully very soon you will be able to read a copy for yourself. But what we do talk about is defining AAM, talking about the challenges that we have today in today's ConOps, how things are evolving, and ways to do personnel selection, identify roles, training. And while this, yes, this comes from a small UAS subcommittee, most of the stuff we're talking about today can relate to the larger UAS as well. So first, why this matters. So I know it's a little bit of an eye chart, unless you're up here. But basically, the gist of this chart is to say that, look, as we all know, UAS technologies and the way they're used is changing by the moment. And I'd say in the last 20 years, and that's really what I want this chart to show, there have been a dramatic increase, not just the proliferation of unmanned aircraft or unmanned vehicles in total, but the technologies that are used to operate them and to utilize them. We can look at on the news each night and see how they're being used in Ukraine. We know from this room how they're used for package delivery, medicine. We're looking at people transport. So there's all these different ways that they're being used. They're being used with more and more frequency.
And the technologies are just growing exponentially by the year. All this will have deep ramifications on the type of person that you select to operate these UAS and the types of training that will be required for this. A couple other things I want to talk about is as you put together a program, and as we talk with different folks like the LA Fire Department, the Police Department, State of Virginia, on how you put these programs together, some of the stuff to keep in mind were maintaining situational awareness, especially not just of your role and your asset, but the folks that you're going to be working with. It could be even other departments, other companies. The other thing was to understand cognitive workload. This is near and dear to me, as a lot of you guys know, but the idea of as you start supervising or managing more and more assets, assuming everything is going fine, that's great. But as you start entering in different exemptions, things start to happen. How many of those issues can one person handle? And how many of those issues can one person handle when they have to do other tasks as well? This is something that doesn't get a whole lot of mention, and we feel that it should. And as we go more to end-to-end, this is something that we think needs to be talked about a whole lot more and have some type of way to identify when tasks are being shed before accidents occur, and how you can have automation come in, how you can train people to understand when they're being overtasked, and how you can train them to understand, learn, and utilize the automation tools that we have at their end. So as we're looking at all this, we started with the initial ConOps that Garrett was actually talking about in his slide presentation. So I won't go over this one, it's the same ConOps. But we started that as a start where you have, one person controlling multiple UAS. And then we also talked with folks from the Los Angeles Fire Department, say, hey, how do you handle this today? How do you get your training program together? How do you pick the people you want to work with? And what was surprising to me, although maybe not that surprising to some of you in the room, a lot of the departments that we spoke with pretty much did the same thing. When it came to personnel selection, it was literally who's interested in doing this and who do we know is fairly responsible when it comes to handling electronic things that are expensive. And then whoever raised their hand, great, you're in. And while I think that's working for them today, I think as these programs get larger, they might need to add some other elements. For the Los Angeles Fire Department, it was kind of interesting because they have very distinct roles. You can be an RPIC, you can be a visual observer, you can be a property officer. You also have multiple levels. So you start off life, part 107, and then you get additional certifications to be able to fly at night, be able to fly indoors. If you do additional training, you can manage payloads, hazardous materials. I think in thinking about this is very similar to how the Los Angeles Fire Department runs their other groups, where you might have a hazmat group, you might have a search and rescue station, where you have these specific roles depending on what they need, but not one station has all of this. And I shall say, if you go to like New York, we're both back up. So both Los Angeles and Denver for their EMS services, you have your day job, you have your night job. You will be a police officer, and oh, by the way, you can also be a drone operator. You can be a firefighter, and oh, by the way, you can also operate drones. With New York City, they actually have their own specific division where that is what you do. You are a drone operator. Now going back to the Denver Police Department, so they see drones as something that can further help with citizen safety. It can be first on scene while officers are waiting to get there, or it can be used in conjunction with officers already get there, give them additional situational awareness. It can also be used to help locate missing persons. And all of their folks, just like in Los Angeles, they start off life as Part 107 certified, and then they have ongoing monthly training keeping up with their UAS operations skills. Also, when putting together a plan, we realized that, talking with these different organizations, the first thing they did was, okay, let's define the role. What does this person need to do? What are their tasks? Who are the right people for the job? What types of training do they need to be operationally ready? We did find gaps, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides when it came to training, that they should probably have that they don't currently have, or at least we aren't seeing that. Also, we had to take a look and say, okay, we know we need to be a manned pilot. What do we need to be an unmanned pilot or an RPIC or or a supervisor or a manager. And we realized that some skills could carry over, but you don't necessarily need to be a man pilot to become a drone operator. And in some cases, maybe it's better off if you aren't even, especially as we go more to automation. Maybe there are certain skills that pilots have that you don't really need to be an operator or supervisor of a highly automated system. So perhaps you need to be really good at system monitoring though, and certainly good at managing automation. You need to have a clear understanding of situational awareness and how to handle the cognitive load. And this is really especially important as we get into those areas of the unknown of what happens when you have multiple issues at once. How do you handle that? And then finally, someone that's really good at decision making. Interestingly, and Wendy's on the line here. So Wendy Erickson's on Man. She's actually my co-lead on ASTM working group for human factor standards for ground control stations. So if you guys are interested in that, please see me after the meeting also. But her group last year had an FAA-sponsored research activity where they were looking at how to do end-to-end, and they were looking at different types of personnel you might want for this. And they found that folks that are gamers, especially gamers that were in high action, high quick decision-making type games, were very good at flying unmanned aircraft. Additionally, folks that had been in the military had a good background that would help them stay organized and situational awareness that you might want for better understanding how to utilize unmanned aircraft as well. So all I'll say, so we came up with a couple ideas based on the research that's been done, the research from people in our own group, talking with these different organizations like the Los Angeles Fire Department, Denver Police Department, State of Virginia, drone responders, to get an idea of what do they do for their selection process. Because as we found, no one had one process that was good for everyone. They all had their own. In some cases, they might borrow it. So it sounds like Texas borrowed from New York, Virginia borrowed from Texas. But a lot of that was because you might have some guy that worked one place and he moved to another place and just carried his stuff with him and reached out to his contacts. So for the selection process, you want someone that had good cognitive abilities, someone that was able to really multitask. Maybe that includes doing activities other than just operating the UAS. One of the folks that worked with us on this paper formerly worked at Loon. Loon was one of those programs or one of those companies that had a program where they had high altitude platforms and they would do 1 to 1,000. And again, it was management by exception. And they found that when everything worked right, and also if you're really high, so you don't have a whole lot of issues up there usually. But when everything worked right, people got really bored. They had a hard time retaining people. So what they did was they identified we need to give these people other things to do. So maybe they were testers, they could test new systems or new code. Maybe they would work with software engineers. What other skills could they give them, either train them on or have them come with them to the job to help keep them engaged, which would help further give them employee retention. As I mentioned before, folks that were experienced in automation already, especially gamers, seem to be pretty apt to take on flying UAS. People that were problem solvers were key, and folks with military experience also were handy. As I was saying before, there's no standardized training yet. There's groups like drone responders that are trying to put something together, and they think that they can have something by the end of next year. They'll be the first training platform, and it's not here yet. We found in talking to folks like drone responders and these other organizations that currently operators lack training and automation. This wasn't that surprising. A lot of the DoD work I do, especially when we're looking at next generation systems for manned platforms, are finding the same thing. That there's nothing out there that's really allowing people to understand, learn, and trust the automation, despite the fact it's coming down very quickly. It'll be in their ships before they know, or in their platforms. Also, current training, as I mentioned before, a lot of times fails to address cognitive burden. It fails to talk about what happens when tasks start to get dropped or when errors are made. How can the system pick up on that? How can someone else help with that? How can you identify it? Or how can the system identify it? Talked about situational awareness before. There's crew resource management strategies that could be utilized. And really all of these things together to help improve situational awareness and maximize or optimize workloads. So where workload's not too high, it's not too low. Goldilocks principle. Additionally, a lot of people are not, this came up earlier today too, a lot of people are not quite yet using augmented reality or flight sims. I know flight sims have been used in manned aviation for a long, long time. They're just now working their way into the unmanned world. I know from the DoD that sometimes the first time technologies make their way to the pilot or when it's in the cockpit, when they call it adventure training, because it might be a 6 to 12 month gap in the SIP before they see it in the sim. So the first time they see it is in the cockpit. And we're kind of pioneers here where we have the opportunity, if we do this right, to develop a training program that has sim-based training embedded, that has the modern day systems that operators need to use. So it kind of gives us a nice little advantage there. Another thing that came up was cybersecurity. So obviously this is big in the DoD world, but it's going to be big in the civilian world as well. And there's not a whole lot of talk about it when it comes to training, to be able to understand cybersecurity, what those attacks might look like, what those malicious actors might look like, and how it might affect your mission. And then the idea that as we have the scalable automation, when we get to the automation that we actually want, there's going to need to be some severe oversight of that that is really talked about. So what this kind of helps talk about as we move forward is that really we want to have some comprehensive training modules. Sounds like companies like Drone Responders are working on a basic module. Sounds like LAFD and Denver Police Department have basic modules, but they really haven't gone in depth on what's going to be needed down the road. Certainly not end to end, which is where we all want to be headed. Also the idea to be able to perform task analyses on the work. There isn't a whole lot of research out there that looks at that. I know, unfortunately, some of you guys are doing that right now. It gets me really excited. But the idea that, hey, you know, how much work goes into this? What does this do to your workload? What does this do to your situational awareness? What does this do to your fatigue? What's it like after you've done a 12-hour mission and you've only got 5 hours of sleep and now you have to go back and do another 12-hour mission? How does that affect your workload? How does that affect your thinking skills? That hasn't been looked at a whole lot when it comes to UAS. And all this can be used as you try to refine what types of roles you really need and what types of training processes you need to put together. So with that said, there's a couple of guidelines that moving forward that we put together here. One is have a safety culture, not just for the systems, but for security, like I was talking about before. Have a comprehensive training program that can really evolve with the technologies. So as we get more automation, have operational procedures in place and really identify, and I know some of the folks are working on this right now, how many UAS can you actually have under your control, given your scenario, given your technologies, given your incentives. And finally, the big idea, the big takeaway here is going back to that chart I originally showed, as technologies are escalating, how can training continue to evolve? So we can keep the same people in those jobs, but continually to train them as these new technologies, these new capabilities, these new concepts come online. Any questions? So I would like to say, in this report that will be going out shortly, we do have parts of training programs in here from Los Angeles Fire Department as well as from the DoD as well. Okay.
You know, many years ago when I worked for the Army, there was always this discussion of tailorable displays and tailorable cockpits for particular pilots, right? So back then you'd say you walk in with a disc. So I guess now you walk in with a flash drive or something. But did you guys talk about that at all? That based on the way that a particular individual goes through the training, that you know you can optimize the displays and the interface differently for that person?
No, it hasn't come up. In fact, when we talk with a lot of the vendors and for the ASTM work, we're looking at what's the basic minimum requirements you would need to put a GCS together. So we're kind of going the other way.
Yeah. So what's the current, is this in review or what's your next steps with this?
So my next steps, depending on what questions I get today, will dictate how much more goes into this. Otherwise, there's like 4 things I circled after I read this again last night to add in tonight, and it'll be ready to go. So it's there.
And have you figured out NASA peer reviewers?
No. So I was actually thinking that when you were talking about it. So I need to select 2 people. that are
Well,
part of this.
you need to talk 2 people into it.
You need 2 people, yeah, you need 2 people who are knowledgeable and have the, what's the word? The cachet to be counted as a peer reviewer. When the branch manager is reviewing the document, they would look at the peer reviewer and say, oh yeah, this individual, yeah, she counts. She knows what she's talking
I
about.
accept our offer to do it. Thank you very much.
I actually, it could be some of the NASA people here who weren't contributors.
Yeah.
That would, I know you're being facetious because you never want me peer review because we'll never get out. No, I think it could be someone who's.
Okay, I have a few in mind. Okay.
You mentioned learning from DoD selection procedures. I know, certainly from my Royal Air Force experience, they use aptitude tests, to match people's roles. Has anyone talked about or developed, identified suitable aptitude tests for?
Yes. So one of the guys, so Rob Owen, who is one of our members, is on SOCOM Special Ops, and he's a drone pilot. And so he sent us over their mill standards, their mill guides, includes aptitude tests. So that discussion's in here. Right.
Yes, you mentioned, maybe, sorry, I missed this, but you mentioned a lot of public safety use cases and then DoD. Did you get much input from industry in terms of like package delivery, that sort of operation?
No, not really. We talked about it a little bit. We have people that were on our group from companies that do that, and they help talk more about part 107 and part 135. But that was about it. We didn't really go into like ConOps, let's say, involved package delivery.
You mentioned the standardized training for end-to-end. I mean, is that feasible, I guess, with the different implementations out there right now? I mean, I think right now, every instance I can think of end-to-end is done very, 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 very differently. And how would you actually standardize training for that?
That's a good question. I think there's some baseline things we can do, such as understanding key technologies like automation or AI that's used. I think there's ways.
Broad and huge buckets,
Right.
Which is.
But I think the other thing is like workload management. I think there's ways today where we can see, when is workload high, and be able to tell them about that, be able to incorporate that into training. That's not done yet.
I would argue we're not ready for standardization of end-to-end training. I mean, we haven't standardized what this group is, what end-to-end is.
We're standardized on the name.
Yeah, right. So arguing a lot of those details. I can see like principles. Yeah, like you might have how to assess workload and how to focus your attention on training on things that matter the most.
Yeah.
I think that was the title of my slides last year was measure what matters. Training what matters might be another way to twist that. So I would be leery of saying we need to standardize a training program for MDN. Maybe more of the principles of how to.
Okay, I can know that. Yeah.
I think that's an important point that's raised as well, actually comparing, the kind of the first responder operations to such as package delivery. One is a very much more dynamic situation where situations on the ground can evolve very rapidly, where you're providing information to providing information to other customers. Whereas you hope the drone delivery is far less dynamic than that. You might have occasional, a weather event, affects a number of aircraft, but otherwise it should be very routine and quite different in terms of the perhaps the temperament or the skill of the operator.
Yeah, I would argue that you have a tougher time with retention of those employees when it is Monday. And so there's additional things you might want to consider throwing in there as well.
Well, you mentioned the appropriate level, what's the appropriate ratio?
Yeah.
Such that you have enough engagement to keep the operator interested and challenged.
Right. Not too much, not too little.
Right.
Yeah.
Goldilocks.
Yeah, just thinking about the training problem. I'd be interested to know, it'd be interesting to figure out like generalized skills that kind of go across all those scenarios or generalized knowledge versus like specific knowledge. That's where you might be able to get like a baseline training program, so you could identify those generalized skills if they exist.
Sure.
Just a thought.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Cool, thanks.